morning. I'll report that if you were here in person, I don't know if anybody's going to be watching this, but there was some treats this morning again. So let that be right. If you come, you might find that there's some treats. Yes. So thank you to my wife for putting together some cherry muffins. So here we are. It's August, and it's weird because the temperatures have come down, right? But the smoke has gone up. Where my mom and dad live in between Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls, they're on the side of the river where there is this parkland fire, they're calling it, but it's actually to the west of them. But it's pretty serious. It's quite a large area now, and there's a lot of homes in that area. So fortunately, it looks like it's just a ground fire. It's not getting into the tree canopies. So keep our fingers crossed. I don't know the storms that went through. It seems like some places it poured rain and others didn't, right? Our house was dry. I think it looks like it rained here because there's puddles in the cracks. Did it pour at your place? Yeah, so it's hit and miss, but they say more rain's coming, so hopefully it will come without winds and lightning. But anyways, lots of rain, hopefully, to keep the fires from happening. So we're on the fourth part of looking at the union of Christian and his newfound friend, Faithful. And so we met Faithful a little bit more, and we kind of began looking at the difference between Faithful's walk, right, and Christian's walk. And I wanted to continue that because, again, what it's illustrating is that we all have a slightly different walk with the Lord, don't we? And part of that, I think, is God has gifted each and every one of us with special experiences that can help. I mean, I was just thinking, yesterday was my mom's memorial, and even this morning, there's several that didn't know that my mom had a baby that didn't make it, not unlike Sister Missy. And so I don't know if my mom got the chance to minister to people like Missy when she lost her child. Lisa's shaking her head yes. No. But anyway, my brother was born, and he was born breech, and he had gotten some of the birthing fluids into his lungs, and that caused him to have pneumonia, and within 24 hours he was gone. If it had been anything but I think it was 50, I want to say maybe 8 or 9, he would have survived in today's technology. But back then they didn't know how to fix that. So again, that's part of my mom's testimony, and it gives her an experience that some don't have, that just like Sister Misty, and Brother Dave, they went through a really, similar heart-wrenching loss, and the pain of it never goes away, but God has gifted them in putting them in position to minister to others. And so what the enemy intends for bad, God uses for good, doesn't he? And one of the exciting things is, and Dave and Missy will find this out when they cross over to that celestial city, somebody's going to be waiting for them, right? That's what's exciting. And that gets us to this, repeat of this idea of God's grand story, right? And the fact that we are weaved into it. And so, again, John Musselman says, now we meet Faithful, whose story is quite different from Christians. The same path, we are all walking the same path, aren't we? I mean, that's the thing about Christianity. There are no branches. And the enemy and our own pride has created these forks in the road that we made, not God. And we are all to walk the same narrow way. The difference is it comes at us a little bit differently in our, and it has to do with our character. just all of the things that make all of us individuals, right? Because God didn't make a bunch of cloned people that are robots. He gave us all personality, and all of our personalities are different, and we all make the beautiful tapestry that is God's handiwork. And so he says God's grand story provides a schematic worldview upon which our individual stories are being written and partially understood. We don't completely understand it, right? Faithful and Christian have been living out their unique stories before the face of God, but now they're traveling together, talking about all the things that had happened to them. And so we talked about this idea of fellowship and how important it is as Christians that we are engaged in fellowship, right? I mean, and again, just to repeat this often repeated thing lately, is that the pandemic has really changed the landscape quite a bit, where people just, they stopped going to church, and they just fell out of that habit and have not picked that back up. And it's not to condemn them, it's just to encourage them that fellowship, God made us for fellowship with himself and with each other, right? And so that's important to remember. The importance, John Musselman says, of Christian fellowship emphasized at the church at the Palace Beautiful is now reinforced. And here we see Christian offering help after receiving it. Here he gives mature advice following his recovery, right? He sped up, and he goes past faithful by a little bit and gets a little pride and stumbles, right? Which is, pride goeth before a fall every time, not just sometimes, every time, right? And so he goes, furthermore, there is revealed a contrast between these two pilgrims who, because of their different characters, face different problems. And again, that's the beauty of it. That's why fellowship is important. We were not meant to be islands, were we? And so we looked at, 1 John 3:14, John says, if we love our brothers and sisters who are believers, it proves that we have passed from death to life. But a person who has no love is still dead. In other words, they don't contribute, they're not part of, right? And so, just picking up the story, then I saw in my dream that both of them went on, I love this, very lovingly together. How many churches would split up if that was what happened, right, in their fellowship? Not many, right? And again, it seems like whenever that happens, it has to do with personalities and egos and pride and all of that sort of thing that tears fellowship apart. But what we want to try to get to in our body is going along very lovingly together, right? And they had delightful conversation about all of the things that had happened to them on their pilgrimage. And so we picked up the story. We were looking at Faithful's story. We saw where, in the first part of it, he flees the city of destruction, and because of Christians fleeing it, and Faithful leaves a little bit later. We got an update on Pliable and what happened to him, and that was that he was somewhat scorned by everybody because he was kind of thought of as a turncoat, a Benedict Arnold, or all those words where nobody wanted to trust him anymore, and he felt the shame of it. That's why it's hard once you've gone down the journey, and you leave. It can be very, very, very difficult to come back, can it? Because you end up having all this additional stuff that you're hauling around that's hard to let go of. And so then this morning we're going to start with this idea of wanton. And I want to say, this is really directed towards men. But can I say, it has, for whatever reason in our culture, it's not politically correct anymore to talk about modesty, right? This young lady who lived in our home for a year, Valerie, the church we were at had this young people's group that they'd come together, they'd live with a family in the church for a year, and then they would do ministry together. And Valerie has just become a beautiful mom and has, two kids. And they live down in Enterprise, Oregon. And she just had posted this thing about modesty, about what it means and why it's important. And one of her friends I noticed posted, we don't see so much modesty anymore. And it's just a reminder. It doesn't mean that the way a man's lustfulness, it's her fault. Because that's what this section here is about. But it means that we all have a responsibility, right? And it's something that even in our church, I've noticed there's some issues. And so I only bring it up because we can't let these things be taboo. But we have to figure out how to open up some dialogue. And that's, again, back to fellowship. Trusting each other and saying, let's have a conversation, right? So that we can all go together and not have any issues and problems. And so here's the story. Faithful says, I escaped the slough of despond, which I understand you fell into. And so I reached the wicket gate without any danger. And as you recall, Christian journey was quite different. He fell into the slough of despond. He got kind of on a tangent over to Mr. Legality's house. And so he had quite a bit different issues. But Faithful arrives at the narrow gate without any danger, except, he says, that there I was propositioned by a woman named Wanton, who intended to do me considerable harm. Christian says, it was just as well you escaped her clutches. In Egypt was severely tested by her, though he escaped her just as you did. Otherwise, she would have cost him his life, and nearly did anyways, right? But what else did she do to you? Faithful says, you cannot imagine, except through personal experience, just how flattering her tongue was, right? And this is not just about lust. This is what the world does. It has a flattering tongue, doesn't it? She pressed me hard to go with her by promising all sorts of sensual pleasure. So the word wanton, what does it mean? Well, causing sexual excitement. Society with streaming television and YouTube and all the stuff that you can now get without having to go to a store and have, it used to be that you have to ask somebody for that. It's tucked behind a counter or something. And now you can just get it in the own privacy of your bedroom, right? And so it's really changed, and it's really devastated, I think, our society. It has made a mess of marriage, of relationships, of how we view each other. And it doesn't matter how much this Me Too movement has gone on, it seems like we still are fighting the same, and that's because the Pandora's box has been opened, right? And so it's once that milk is spilt, it's hard to get it back in the bottle. And so the fact that John Musselman says, the fact that Faithful was untroubled by the slough of despond in contrast with Christian, and yet was severely tried by seductive Wanton, is intended by Bunyan to convey the important truth that, according to individual characteristics, all of us are different, pilgrims are prone to be troubled by distinctive temptations that are geared towards our personality, right? And that's the thing to remember. Again, Satan's been at it a lot longer than we have. And each of us has our own weaknesses that he's going to try to pull on the threads, right, that unravels the fabric of our life. Faithful was propositioned after entering the wicket gate. So whereas Christian was assailed at this place by remember the arrows of the devils. He was at the gate and suddenly these arrows were landing, left and right. And he was under attack. Well, Wanton's attack was much different, but still just as deadly. So he, at the place by arrows of devils under the command of Captain Beelzebub, Faithful was here accosted by a lewd woman named Madame Wanton. We further know from some of Bunyan's other writings that her custom was to organize merry balls attended by her close acquaintances, Mrs. Light-Minded, Mrs. Love the Flesh, Mr. Lechery, and Mrs. Filth. right? So she had previously tested Joseph, Christian said, right? We all know the story, Potiphar's wife, right? She tried to seduce him. So now we have HBO Max and Showtime and all these made-for-TV dramas that you can get if you subscribe to one of them. And they are no different. They are trying to seduce you. And it troubles me to hear so many Christian people who watch this junk without any shame. It used to be, we called HBO, what? Anybody remember? Hell's box office? Because that's what it was, and still is today. And so it does come back to this idea of guarding our minds, doesn't it? And guarding our eyes. And so this is what happened to Joseph. But he fled, right? And still got in trouble. But he fled. So he took the high ground, even though Satan again tried to put him down. Here's some scriptures. 1 Corinthians 10:13. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. But God is faithful. Right? Again, it's so aptly named in this part of the story that Bunyan gives, faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. Sometimes we struggle with this, don't we? Because we can't seem to just get over the hump sometimes. But God is faithful. That's what grace is for, isn't it? Is to help us get over that hump. It says, when you are tempted, he says he will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. So sometimes, isn't the problem is we choose not to walk through that door? Yeah. And so it comes back to that obedience thing and being submitted to the Lord, right? 2 Timothy 2:22. Run from anything that stimulates youthful lusts. He doesn't say walk, turn. He says run. Instead, pursue righteous living, faithfulness, love, and peace. Enjoy the companionship of those who call on the Lord with pure hearts. What is that a definition of? Fellowship. That's why we want to gather together. It's all part of God's plan. So she flattered with her tongue. Yesterday I thought it was kind of funny. So my brother-in-law's mom, Jolene, she's getting up there in years, and she's had some health issues. And one of my friends that I grew up with out in the Pleasant View area, Kevin, was just saying, man, you just look so good. And Jolene goes, I'm going to take him home with me. He was flattering her, wasn't he? In a nice way. But what is that? That's exactly what a flattering tongue is trying to do. For you to invite them into your life, right? And this is the issue. All sorts of pleasure and carnal content flowed from her soliciting lips. She almost confounded his senses with her subtle suggestions. And that's what the honesty, keep in mind, this was written 300 years ago. It was just as much a problem then as it is today. It's just that today we are more bold about it, and it's out in the public square. Back then it was all hidden, right? So, back to the story, Christian recalls the wages. The wages of sin is, and that's the thing that's always hidden from view in this, isn't it? So in the story, Christian says, thank God you have escaped her, since it is the abhorred of the Lord who shall fall into her ditch. Faithful says, true, and this is worth a little conversation, but I am still not sure if I have totally escaped her pleading. It reminds me of a story I read, and I forget his first name, but his last name was Brown. He was a SEAL, and he lost his life in Afghanistan, saving his fellow soldiers. He actually took enemy fire so that they were diverted from, so the others could escape. But his story is so powerful because it talks about God's grace. He grew up in an Assembly of God church, and somehow he got caught up in a life of drugs. And so he thought that in order to do that, discipline was his thing, and so that's how he ended up in the SEALs. And through that he married a godly woman, and was again trying to live the Christian life, but he could not escape that woman's lips, that woman of drug addiction that kept calling him. And he said it was one of those things where I'd be pumping gas at the gas station, and I'd look across and I'd see somebody that I immediately knew could give me some drugs. And once he had given into that, his wife would have to go searching and find him in some drug house somewhere in some God-forbidden area. And it was his struggle in his entire adult life up until the time the Lord finally took him home. And some said maybe that was God's grace for him, because he was going out as a hero. But it just shows that there are those kinds of things that we have to be so careful of, right? And there are things that for me, I can't do, and maybe you can. Alcohol is one of those things, right? I don't have an addictive personality, but I do have people in my family that do. And so for me, it's not even a difficult decision. I will abstain from that because I do not want to lure them into that falseness that I can drink and it's okay, because many can't, right? That's why alcohol is evil. And plus the fact that it destroys families and lives. So true, but I am still not sure if I have totally escaped her pleading. That's a nice warning for us, isn't it? Christian says, why? I trust you did not agree to her solicitation, did you? And Faithful says, no, I did not defile myself with her. For I remembered an old writing which I had seen that declared her steps descend down to hell. So I shut my eyes. Amen. That's exactly what we as men have to do, is turn our eyes away and say no to what Satan is trying to do. So he says, so I shut my eyes to prevent myself from being bewitched with her seductive looks. Then she suddenly became angry and abused me, at which I quickly departed from her. And that again is just another thing of the world, isn't it? If you're not going to join with them, they don't like that, because they feel the judgment and the conscience of the Holy Spirit convicting them, right? His intentional breaking of eye contact with Madame Wanton was a wise course of action. Only when then did her sweetness turn to gall and venomous scorn, as was the case with Potiphar's wife, right? It's all roses and everything's great until you say no. Charles Spurgeon, he said this: observe that although Faithful did not yield to Wanton's tempting, he says, I know not whether I did wholly escape her or no. He says, the probability is that the temptations of the flesh, even when resisted, do us an injury. If the coals do not burn us, they blacken us. And again, it's just a reminder for us to remember. And that's what another Charles Bridges says. Ponder this chapter. You that know not the poison and corruption of fleshly lusts. Right? Because we can all fall. Yes. And Paul said what? Make sure that you're prepared so that you can stand, lest you fall. Perhaps, he goes on, painful experience had given the wise man wisdom and understanding Therefore, attend to it with fear and trembling. We've talked about that, right? Engrafted wisdom is the only effectual safeguard. That's what we're doing here, is we're learning wisdom, aren't we? And it goes on, this heavenly influence teaches us both to regard discretion for the covering of our souls and to keep knowledge for the warning of our fellow sinners. And that goes back to this idea that as a church body, we need to be comfortable having conversations that might be awkward, right? And again, it's not to create shame. It's for people to understand, right, these things. And so that's wanton. And there's this really interesting story about the first Adam. Here it goes. Did you meet with any other assaults as you went on your way? He says. Faithful goes, well, when I came to the foot of the hill Difficulty, I met a very old man who asked me who I was and where I was going. I replied that I was a pilgrim going to the celestial city. Then he commented, you look like an honest fellow. Will you consider the contentment that is available by living with me? And especially the wages I am prepared to offer? Then I asked him his name and where he lived. He said his name was Adam the First, and that he resided in the town of Deceit. Right? Then I inquired of him what his line of business was and what exactly the wages were that he offered. To this he responded that his employment offered many delights, and that his wages were full heirship in his family. He's going to be like a son or a daughter. I further asked him details concerning the support of his household and the servants that he kept. So he explained that his household was maintained with a great variety of exotic dainties gleaned from the four corners of the world. Further, his servants were his own children. Then I asked him how many children he had, and he replied that there were only 3, all daughters. What were their names? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Right? He said that I could marry them if I so wished. Then I asked how long I could expect to live with them, and he answered, as long as he himself lived. So what is this all about? It's this idea of worldliness, isn't it? Right? That job with the big bucks or whatever the lure is, whether it's, notoriety or fame, or maybe it's, something more, sensual, like, there's just any number of things that the world wants to offer us, isn't it? So you can see here, there's a theme, right? For faithful. Different than Christian, and apparently faithful has something to work on here. For Christian, it's his pride. For faithful, it's the appeals of the flesh and whatnots. And so faithful's distinctive weakness in the flesh continues to be assailed, yet in a slightly different manner. The location here is at the bottom of the hill Difficulty, and again, it elicits an intended contrast. When Christian was there, what did he do? He took a drink. He replenished his strength with the water of the stream that was right there. And versus little conflict for our friend Faithful. To begin with, it seems that unlike his companion, Faithful did not drink at the refreshing spring. So Kelman says this, Adam the First is an extension of the idea of wanton, representing an appeal not to any one appetite, but to the entire sensuous side of a man, to all that is of the earth. See, the thing is so often what happens is you see people get caught up in pursuing the things of this earth. Again, not necessarily bad things, right? But the problem is so often, as Jesus said, what does money do? It corrupts us, doesn't it? And it's my feeling that only a few can escape that. Right? But we see the lesson of Job. Job was a wealthy man, and he lost it all, but God gave it back to him because Job could handle it, apparently. And so often we've built entire denominations around this idea that wealth is what God's blessing, therefore you must be doing something right, right? And so we have to have pastors with airplanes and jets and we, all this kind of as a show of God's blessing. And the fact of the matter is God blesses the poorest person in Africa just as much as he does you and I, right? We're all sons and daughters of the King. So this episode corresponds, interestingly, right? What happened to Christian on the way up the hill? He got a little tired. Took a nap, right? So he wasn't completely, right? That was a bit of a sensual pleasure that he took, and it cost him. And so this episode, he says, corresponds to Christian's sleep in the arbor on that same hill difficulty. And the difference of experience is determined simply by the different natures of these two men. It was natural for Faithful to take his relaxation in a broader and more voluptuous form than Christian. Yet their temptation is the same, right? So Adam the first depicts the first man, Adam, right? Not necessarily, it's the idea of Adam. What did Adam do? God told him, don't touch this tree. And he did, right? Why? Because the appeal of Satan, that it would open your eyes and you'd be just like God, was appealing to him. Lust of the flesh, right? And so, is an extension of the, where was I? Adam, the first man, or original fallen Adam, in contrast with the last Adam. And who's the last Adam? Jesus Christ, right? Further, he represents the old man, right? The unregenerated natural man. Every one of us has an old man or woman, right? That we put to death when we were baptized, right? We put them under. And when we came out of that water, we were what? We were part of the new Adam, weren't we? And so he goes on, in contrast with the new man or regenerated spiritual man. In other words, Adam the first tempts the new spiritual man, Faithful, to yield to the old man embodied in the worldly and corrupt shell of the flesh. It's one of those things where, we say that we need to bury the old man. And one of the things I've always enjoyed is the idea of, we were talking about memorial stones. You put the memorial stones on that grave, and that prevents you from pulling them off and inviting that old man back into your life, right? Because you got to go through all those testimonies. That's why they're important. That's why remembering what God has done in our life is so, so important. Ephesians 4:21 and 22. Since you have heard about Jesus and have learned the truth that comes from him, what are you supposed to do? Throw off that old sinful nature and your former way of life, which is corrupted by lust and deception. That's a big contrast today in our churches. Nowadays, we're saying you don't need to throw all that junk away. In fact, it's interesting where you see in the media nowadays where Muslims will do these book burnings and all these things, and they just cast scorn on it. Well, we should be doing it sometimes too. Pastor Dan, I think, talks about having taken a lot of stuff out of their house and burning it. Right? Ephesians 4:23, again, 23 and 24, instead, right? Let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature, created, right, to be like God, truly righteous and holy. We put off that old man, those rags, and we keep that new coat that was given by the angels, right? He offers his worthless pedigree. I've arrived. I am something. Join me. Join my company, right? By dwelling in the town of deceit, the old self-man is being corrupted with the lusts of deceit. Because the heart is deceitfully wicked, isn't it? And that's the problem, is we get, our brain starts creating some justifications. Oh, I don't need to go to church regularly. I'm just going out into nature, God's own church, right? How many times have we heard that? It's okay to take a vacation. Let's make sure we're not taking a vacation, though, from life. And life is part of fellowship. He offers employment for a right of inheritance, right? I promise you, in business, we have these things, what's it called? Vesting. The goal of it is to say, okay, you'll get a piece of this company, but you got to work. In my company, it's 15 years. You got to work 15 years before you're fully vested, right? That's what he's promising here. You work for me, you'll inherit everything I got. God said, if you work for me, what does he do? Everything I have is yours, right? There's a big difference. By requiring the expenditure of much energy of the flesh, he has gathered many servants who have the right of inheritance conferred upon them. They at first delight in sensual pleasure and then inherit corruption. Because it doesn't go anywhere. You're not going to cross that river to the celestial city if you're one of his. It's only being one of Christ, right? So Galatians 6:12. Those who are trying to force you to be circumcised want to look good to others. We can apply that to a whole host of things, right? They don't want to be persecuted for teaching that the cross of Christ alone can save. It's so simple. He offers the world a house full of worldly dainties, right? One of the things that in one of my earlier offices, I worked for a fellow in Coeur d'Alene, and we worked for, Dwayne Hagedon, the guy that built the Coeur d'Alene Resort and all that, and RG, it seemed like, would always get caught up in the lifestyle of these rich and famous people and want to live like that. And he didn't have the means to do it. It's one of the reasons why I originally was thinking about being a partner with him, but I saw that and I was like, that's going to be my ruin, right? Because you're doing all these beautiful homes that none of us could afford, ever, probably most of us, and it's attractive. Let's be honest, it is attractive. He went with Dwayne to go pick out a Bentley down in Palm Springs, a $200,000 car. What's not to like about that? Unless you don't like Bentleys. But that's the problem. Is we are attracted to that, and Satan knows this. By cultivating the deeds of the flesh, he bears many children of wrath who live in the lusts of the flesh, indulging the desires of the flesh and of the mind. Just the other day, there was this big riot in New York City. Why? Well, this one influencer had said, hey, I've got a bunch of these Game Boy gift cards that I'm going to give you. And that caused so many of these young people to come and congregate in this one area, and they didn't see him, so they started just tearing the place apart. Because of greed, because of, somebody promised me something, and I put forth the effort to get down here, right? So now I'm going to extract something. This seems to be the mentality of our culture these days. Galatians 5, 19 through 21. When you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the results are very clear, right? Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension and division. The list keeps going. Envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. Let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone, not some, anyone, Paul says, living that sort of life, and what's the difference? Have we all maybe sometimes given to quarreling? or anger, right? What's the difference? Are you making a practice of it, or are you repenting from it? Right? That's the difference. If you are making that sort of life out of doing these things, you will not cross that river to the celestial city. Right? And so he goes on, he said this in Ephesians 2:3. Whoops. All of us used to live that way. Right? A child, before you can even teach him anything, what do? They snatch that toy from their neighbor. Where did they get that? Adam the first. Because we have that sin nature, right, implanted in us. All of us used to live that way, following the passionate desires and inclinations of our sinful nature. But by our very nature, we were subject to God's anger, just like everyone else. I feel like I need to get through this because there is an uplifting end, but I'm only halfway. I'm on slide 9. I got 12. So I think we should end here, and we'll continue. Has this been good? Have you? Again, it's not that this is gospel, right? But it illustrates the gospel. And that's the beauty of this story, to help us grab a hold of some of these truths and remember them in a word picture, right? And that's why, again, I just keep coming back to this. That's why this story has been such a powerful story down through the ages. Amen? So, Lord, thank you for this time. We just praise you, Lord, again, for this story that you blessed Mr. Bunyan with all these years ago. And God, I just pray, Father, that even as we've gone through this, Lord, maybe there's some of this stuff that while we may not be, downloading child pornography, maybe there's something else that we are doing that we need to put on the altar. So, Lord, I just pray, God, that we would make a renewed covenant with our eyes, as men especially, that we will not look upon a woman in lustfulness. God, that we would learn to turn our eyes the other way. And God, I pray that in our church body, Lord, that we all together, all of us, Lord, would learn a measure of modesty when we come together and we're in public, Lord, so that we can be an example, Lord, of a healthy, wholesome church. And I ask these things, Lord. I ask that your Holy Spirit would just continue to be with us. And in Jesus' name we pray.